Stefanie Damron was just 14 years old when she vanished from New Sweden, Maine. It was the evening of September 23, 2024. After a small argument with her sister, Stefanie walked out of the house. She never came back. She didn't take her phone. She didn't take her wallet. She left with only the clothes on her back: a blue long-sleeve shirt, jeans, and a pair of black Harley Davidson boots. By nightfall, she was gone without a trace. At first, her family thought she might be cooling off, walking through the wooded trails near her home. But hours passed, then days. The search widened. Police, neighbors, and volunteers scoured the fields and forests. Helicopters flew overhead. Dogs tracked the ground. Not a single clue turned up. The FBI joined the case, treating it as a high-risk missing child investigation. They released her photo nationwide and put up a $15,000 reward. Still, weeks later, there was no sign of Stefanie. How does a teenage girl vanish in a small, rural town, surrounded by people who know each other, without anyone seeing where she went? How can a child step outside after a family argument and disappear as if the world simply swallowed her whole? This is the story of the disappearance of Stefanie Damron, a story that begins with a quiet evening in northern Maine and turns into one of the most unsettling mysteries of 2024. Stefanie Damron was just 14 years old. She lived in New Sweden, a quiet rural town in Aroostook County, Maine. In a place where everyone knew everyone, her absence would stand out immediately. But on the afternoon of September 23, 2024, Stefanie walked away from her home and never returned. What makes this case so chilling is not just the disappearance itself, but who she was, how she lived, and how unlikely it seemed that she would ever simply vanish. Stefanie was born in 2010. She was an 8th grader at the local middle school, described by teachers and classmates as polite, friendly, and a little shy. She wasn't the kind of teenager who went looking for trouble. She wasn't the kind to rebel, to run off, or to break rules. Friends recall that if anything, Stefanie liked routine. She liked walking the same paths through the woods near her house, feeding the animals that gathered at the edge of the yard, and being home before dark. She stood about 5 feet tall, roughly 1.52 meters. She weighed around 130 pounds, with shoulder-length brown hair and striking blue eyes. On the day she disappeared, she was wearing a long-sleeved blue shirt, blue jeans, and a pair of black Harley Davidson hiking boots. Those details have been repeated countless times in missing person alerts because they remain the last confirmed description anyone has of her. Her family life, at least on the surface, looked stable. Stefanie lived with her parents and her older sister. Their house was set in rural Maine, surrounded by woods, fields, and trails. The Damron family was not in the headlines before this incident. They weren't wealthy, they weren't in trouble, they weren't known for disputes. By all accounts, they lived like many families in Aroostook County: quiet, working class, and close-knit. But like many siblings, Stefanie and her sister argued. On September 23rd, they had what her family later described as a small argument. It wasn't violent. It wasn't unusual. Just words exchanged between two teenagers living under the same roof. Yet minutes after that argument, Stefanie walked out the door. No phone, no wallet, no belongings that would suggest she planned to leave for long. She walked into the woods near her house and was never seen again. This is one of the details that investigators keep circling back to. If Stefanie had stormed off to make a point, she would almost certainly have returned. Her family said she had no history of running away, no prior incidents of sneaking out, no friends she was secretly meeting. no reason to vanish. That afternoon, she left with nothing but the clothes she was wearing. People in New Sweden describe Stefanie as the kind of girl everyone knew, even if only in passing. She was the teenager you'd see helping at small community events, the one walking down the street with a backpack, headed home after school, the one who always waved back when a neighbor greeted her. For many in town, she wasn't just another kid. She was part of the rhythm of the community. That's what makes her disappearance even harder to understand. Neighbors could not believe it when police started asking if they'd seen her. Many said Stefanie never caused problems. Some even recalled seeing her walking calmly on the day she disappeared, not looking upset or panicked. It was just a normal day, until it wasn't. The vulnerability is clear. Stefanie didn't have a phone with her. She didn't have money. She didn't carry personal items. She didn't leave a note or send a message. Her departure was not planned. If she had been intending to vanish, she left behind every tool that would have helped her do so. That suggests she meant to step away only briefly, and yet, that short step out the door turned into the start of a nightmare. Investigators often highlight how important these details are. A 14-year-old girl, barely 5 feet tall, unarmed, and without communication, walking into wooded land alone. That is a dangerous situation in itself. Add the possibility of an encounter with the wrong person at the wrong time, and it becomes even more alarming. Her habits also matter. Stefanie was known to enjoy walking the trails near her house. That was part of her routine. She wasn't afraid of the woods. She had grown up in that environment. But this time, the familiarity didn't protect her. The fact that she knew the trails well makes it less likely that she simply got lost. She had walked them many times before and always returned. For law enforcement, one of the most troubling contrasts is between Stefanie's normal life and the sudden disappearance. On the surface, everything looked ordinary. A small-town teenager, a family home, a rural setting. Nothing to suggest danger. But behind that ordinary picture was a situation where a child could walk away and be gone without a trace. This contrast fuels the central question of the case. How does a 14-year-old, with no history of running away, no preparation for leaving, and no resources to survive on her own, vanish in broad daylight, just steps from her own front door? It's not just a mystery for her family. It's a mystery that haunts the entire town. Police have noted that the argument with her sister might explain why Stefanie walked out. But it does not explain why she didn't return. Arguments between siblings happen every day. They don't end with... The description of Stefanie became central to every missing person poster, every news alert, every press release. Blue eyes, brown hair, shoulder length, about 5 feet tall. Last seen in a blue long-sleeve shirt, blue jeans, and black hiking boots. Those details are repeated because they are the only firm link to the moment she walked out. Without them, there is nothing. The community of New Sweden responded quickly once the news spread. Flyers were posted, social media filled with her photo. Volunteers began searching. But even in those early days, the details of Stefanie's life made the situation look grim. A teenager with no resources, no phone, and no history of leaving voluntarily simply doesn't vanish without help, or without harm. Stefanie's vulnerability was undeniable. Her young age, her small size, and the fact that she had poor vision in certain conditions made her dependent on adults for safety. Without a phone, she couldn't call for help. Without money, she couldn't travel far. Without a plan, she had no way to survive on her own. All of this pointed to one conclusion. Something serious happened to her that afternoon. For her family, that fact is devastating. They live with the memory of a small argument that suddenly became the last interaction they had with their daughter and sister. They know she didn't intend to vanish forever. They know she would have come back if she could. That's why they believe someone or something prevented her return. The introduction of Stefanie's life and her habits leaves investigators with one undeniable truth. Her disappearance is not consistent with a runaway case. It is not consistent with a teenager choosing to cut ties. It is consistent with foul play, with an accident, or with an abduction. And each of those possibilities carries its own horror. As the days turned into weeks and weeks into months, the weight of this contrast became heavier. Stefanie's simple, ordinary life, a family home, a small-town school, walks in the woods, was shattered by an event that remains unexplained. For a community that prides itself on safety and trust, it was a wake-up call. And that is where the haunting question returns, the one that still hangs over New Sweden, Maine. How could a girl like Stefanie Damron, with no history of running away, disappear in broad daylight just steps away from September 23rd, 2024. It was late afternoon in New Sweden, Maine. Inside a quiet family home, two sisters exchanged sharp words. Stefanie Damron, just 14 years old, argued with her older sister. It wasn't violent. It wasn't shocking. It was the kind of tension that sparks between siblings anywhere. Raised voices, hurt feelings. Then silence. But this silence didn't fade with time. It turned into something irreversible. After the fight, Stefanie wanted space. She decided to go outside. She walked out of the house, choosing fresh air over more conflict. What she wore would later be burned into memory. A long-sleeved blue shirt, blue jeans, a pair of black Harley Davidson hiking boots. She carried nothing else, no phone, no money, no bag. Her decision looked temporary. This wasn't the picture of a girl planning to leave home. Sometime between 4 and 5 p.m., a neighbor noticed Stefanie. She was walking calmly along a dirt road near her house. The neighbor saw her heading toward a wooded trail, a path children in New Sweden had walked for years. The sight didn't raise alarm. The neighbor didn't think twice. It was normal to see Stefanie outside. That short, ordinary glimpse became the last confirmed sighting of her. From that moment, she disappeared. The sun sank lower. Daylight faded. Inside the Damron home, her family expected her to return. The fight had been small. Surely she would cool off and come back. Dinner came. Her seat stayed empty. Evening passed. The door never opened. By nightfall, worry took over. Stefanie had never stayed away this long. Her parents called neighbors, friends, anyone who might have seen her. But no one had. By 9 p.m., the fear could no longer be dismissed. Her parents picked up the phone and called the police. Their words were simple, but devastating. "Our daughter is missing." Police officers arrived quickly. They began with the basics. Where had she gone? What was she wearing? Who had seen her last? The family explained the fight with her sister. They repeated what the neighbor saw. They pointed to the woods. Officers searched the property. They looked in the yard, the outbuildings, along the road. Flashlights cut into the trees at the edge of the forest. But the light revealed nothing. No footprints, no clothing, no dropped items. Stefanie had walked into the woods, and no trace of her remained. From the beginning, her disappearance carried red flags. First, she had no phone. There was no way for her to call for help, no way for anyone to track her movements. Second, she had no history of running away. Her parents told officers that Stefanie had never threatened to leave. She had never disappeared before. She wasn't the type to vanish out of rebellion. Third, the argument had been minor. It wasn't the kind of fight that would make someone abandon their home forever. Certainly not without taking clothes, money, or belongings. The situation didn't match the profile of a runaway. It matched the profile of a child in danger. That first night, officers widened the search. They drove the back roads of New Sweden. They circled through farm fields and dirt paths. Volunteers joined with flashlights. Dogs were brought to pick up her scent. But the dogs lost the trail almost immediately. They couldn't follow her beyond the path where the neighbor had last seen her. It was as if she had walked into the woods and vanished into thin air. The police questioned the Damron family again. They confirmed the timeline. The fight happened in the afternoon. Stefanie left shortly afterward. She wore the clothes her sister described. The neighbor's account matched. The time, the direction, the path, everything lined up. But after that, the timeline went dark. No other neighbors saw her. Investigators considered every possibility. Had she wandered too far and gotten lost? Searchers covered every trail, but there was no sign of her. Had she fallen into water? Divers checked rivers and ponds nearby. They found nothing. Had she been picked up by someone? No car was seen. No tire tracks matched the time frame. Theories circled, but none had evidence behind them. Her parents, Crystal and John, repeated the same words. She would have come home. They knew her habits. She always returned before dark. She had no reason to run away. The fight with her sister had been small. Nothing about it explained a total disappearance. The police agreed. By the end of the first day, they classified the case not as a runaway, but as suspicious. That label meant they believed something more serious had happened. For investigators, the critical question was time. Between 4 p.m. and 9 p.m., Stefanie went from being a visible child walking a trail to a missing person. 5 hours. That was the window. If she was lost, why hadn't she called for help? If she was hurt, why wasn't she found nearby? If she was taken, how did it happen in daylight in a small town without anyone noticing? Those missing hours became the center of the case. By late September, posters with Stefanie's face were taped to windows, pinned to bulletin boards, and nailed to telephone poles across Aroostook County. Her description was repeated again and again. 14 years old, 5 feet tall, 130 pounds, brown hair, blue eyes. Last seen wearing a blue shirt, jeans, and black hiking boots. The description reached the news. Local stations broadcast it on repeat. The image of her young face became impossible to ignore. But the trail remained cold. Her disappearance shocked New Sweden. The town was small. The unanswered questions pressed down on everyone involved. What happened in those missing hours? Did Stefanie encounter someone she knew? Did a stranger intercept her path? Did an accident occur that no one discovered? Every option seemed possible, but none were proven. Investigators returned again and again to the timeline. At 4 p.m. she was seen alive. At 9 p.m. she was reported missing. The world in between those two times remains empty. That emptiness defined the case. The search would soon expand beyond local law enforcement. State police and later the FBI would take over. But the mystery began here, on an ordinary September day after an ordinary fight, when a 14-year-old girl walked into the woods and never came back. That moment is frozen. It is the beginning of every question that followed. It is the gap investigators have tried and failed to close. Part 3 closes with the question that still haunts New Sweden, Maine. What happened in those missing hours, between the moment Stefanie walked into the woods and the time her family realized she was gone for good? On the night of September 23rd, 2024, as the sun slipped behind the tree line of New Sweden, the search for 14-year-old Stefanie Damron began. Her parents had just reported her missing. Police wasted no time. A command post was set up in town. Flashlights cut through the dark. Patrol cars moved slowly along dirt roads. Officers and volunteers fanned out across the forest edge, determined to bring her home. Canine units were the first to arrive. Dogs were walked along the narrow path where Stefanie had last been seen. For a short distance, the dogs pulled hard, their noses to the ground. But within minutes, the trail went cold. The scent ended abruptly, just a few hundred yards from her house. There was no sign of where she went next. By dawn, dozens of volunteers had gathered. The town of New Sweden was small, but its people showed up. Farmers, hunters, and neighbors joined the search. They combed fields and backyards. They moved in straight lines through the woods. Some carried rifles, not to hunt, but to guard against wildlife in the dense forest. Others carried radios, coordinating with police as they pushed deeper into the trees. The first 48 hours are critical in any disappearance. Everyone knew that. So they searched without pause. Helicopters and drones swept overhead. Horses were brought in to navigate rough trails. The forest floor was scanned inch by inch. Creeks, ditches, and swampy patches were cleared. Even abandoned barns and old hunting shacks were entered and checked. But nothing turned up. Days passed, and the operation grew. The Maine State Police and the Aroostook County Sheriff's Office stepped in. Together they directed one of the largest search efforts the county had ever seen. Search grids were mapped across dozens of square miles. Volunteers were assigned areas to cover. Drones flew in tight patterns, capturing high-resolution images. Boats patrolled nearby rivers. At night, spotlights lit up sections of woods while canine teams tried again and again. The community's involvement was overwhelming. Residents who had never met Stefanie joined the search lines. Churches opened their doors, offering food and shelter to searchers. Restaurants donated meals. A local gas station gave free fuel to volunteers who drove ATVs through the woods. Flyers were printed by the hundreds. They were taped to store windows, gas pumps, and mailboxes all across northern Maine. Her face, with its brown hair and blue eyes, was suddenly everywhere. But the posters never brought new leads. Not a single confirmed sighting came in. By mid-October, the effort had grown into one of the largest searches in Maine in years. Searchers covered more than 20 square miles of forest and farmland. They drained sections of marshland. They sent divers into rivers. They dug through debris piles. Nothing. Experts were called in. They reviewed the search tactics, the terrain, and the timeline. Their conclusion was grim. If Stefanie had walked into the woods and gotten lost, some trace of her should have been found. The absence of evidence suggested something else. As winter approached, the formal ground search slowed. Snow covered the trails. Cold weather made large-scale efforts dangerous. But even then, small groups of volunteers refused to stop. They searched in pairs, on snowmobiles, hoping to spot something overlooked. Each trip ended the same way, with silence. The media kept the case alive. Local television stations broadcast updates every night. Reporters called it the search without a trace. Newspapers across Maine featured front-page stories on the case. National outlets picked it up, pointing out how rare it was for a child to vanish so completely, so close to home, without anyone seeing what happened. The public watched closely. Parents across New England asked how a girl could vanish in broad daylight, just steps from her home. For many, The story of Stefanie Damron became a nightmare that could happen to any family. By December 2024, months of effort had produced no answers. Thousands of man-hours, hundreds of volunteers, state resources, and advanced technology had all failed. Search leaders admitted what no one wanted to hear. There were no solid leads left. The case had reached a standstill. But her family never gave up. They pressed the police for updates. They called reporters to keep her story alive. They asked the community to keep searching. And the community. By the end of 2024, the disappearance of Stefanie Damron was no longer just a missing persons case. It was a mystery that defined the town. It was a question that hung over every home, every street, and every forest trail. How could a 14-year-old girl walk into the woods and never be seen again? How could dozens of officers, search dogs, drones, and helicopters come up empty? How could hundreds of volunteers cover mile after mile, only to find nothing? The questions were louder than the answers, and as the year closed, one haunting truth remained. Stefanie was gone, and nobody knew where she was.
On September 23, 2024, 14-year-old Stefanie Damron walked out of her home in New Sweden, Maine after a small argument with her sister. She never returned. For weeks, local police, state investigators, and hundreds of volunteers combed the woods, fields, and waterways. They searched on foot, with dogs, on horseback, and even with drones. They found nothing. Not a shoe, not a scrap of clothing, not a single personal item. By late 2024, the case had gone cold. With months passing and no answers, local law enforcement admitted they had reached the limits of their resources. That's when the FBI stepped in. The disappearance of a 14-year-old girl with no trace and no progress was too serious to remain just a local investigation. It became a federal case. The FBI brought new tools and new expertise. They have the manpower, the technology, and the national reach to take the search beyond Aroostook County. The first step was escalation, treating Stefanie's disappearance not as a missing child report, but as a possible abduction or foul play with interstate implications. Agents immediately pulled traffic camera data across northern Maine. They expanded their scope into neighboring states and even into Canada just across the border. Every vehicle recorded on rural highways that day was scrutinized. They were searching for anything unusual, especially the report of a dark-colored pickup truck near the trail where Stefanie was last seen. Behavioral analysts were called in to build possible scenarios. Could Stefanie have simply walked further than expected and become lost? Was there a chance she left home intentionally? Or, more disturbingly, had someone taken her against her will? Given her age, her lack of a phone or money, and her history of always returning home, the runaway theory was quickly ruled out. Analysts leaned heavily toward abduction. The FBI also went through records of sex offenders, and some new witnesses came forward from surrounding communities. A few thought they had seen a girl who resembled Stefanie at gas stations or convenience stores in other towns, but none of those reports held up. The one detail that remained intriguing was the sighting of the dark pickup truck. A neighbor reported it parked near the woods around the same time Stefanie was last seen. The problem: there was no license plate number, no clear description of the driver, and no surveillance video. The lead was logged, but unresolved. At the same time, investigators turned to Stefanie's digital footprint. They examined her social media accounts, her school emails, and any online activity. Nothing had been updated since the day she vanished.
Medical and school records were checked for any sign of her reappearing under another identity. Bank accounts and public assistance records tied to her family were reviewed for suspicious activity. Again, nothing. To the FBI, this confirmed one chilling fact. Stefanie had not simply left home. She had disappeared from all systems on the exact day she walked into the woods. The lack of digital or physical evidence only deepened the mystery. In today's world, it is almost impossible for a teenager to vanish without leaving any trace. No online activity, no phone data, no camera footage, no financial trail. Yet that is exactly what happened here. To keep the case alive and encourage the public's help, the FBI made a major announcement. A reward of $15,000 was offered for any information leading to Stefanie's recovery or to an arrest in her disappearance. The notice went out across Maine newspapers, on television, and even nationally. The FBI published it on their official website, ensuring anyone with a potential lead would know they could come forward safely, and anonymously, if needed. The reward was designed to shake loose information from people who might be hesitant. Maybe someone had seen that dark pickup truck but thought it wasn't important. Maybe someone had overheard a suspicious conversation but didn't want to get involved. $15,000 was meant to break the silence. Despite the announcement, tips came in slowly. Each one was carefully checked. Some were dead ends almost immediately, while others took weeks to eliminate. Reports of sightings in Bangor, in Portland, and even across the Canadian border were investigated. None matched Stefanie. Each false lead left the family, the community, and investigators more frustrated. The media narrative also shifted. This was no longer described as a teen runaway or a local missing case. With the FBI's involvement, the story was framed as a federal criminal investigation. National news outlets picked it up. Commentators asked the obvious question: how could a child disappear in broad daylight so close to home without anyone noticing? Parents across New England paid attention. Communities demanded answers, not just for Stefanie, but for what her disappearance represented. If it could happen in quiet, rural New Sweden, it could happen anywhere. The FBI kept emphasizing that the family, meanwhile, clung to the hope that federal involvement might finally deliver answers. They cooperated with every interview, every search, every announcement. They believed that if anyone could break the silence, it was the FBI. By the end of 2024, though, even with national attention, high-level resources, and a monetary reward on the table, the case was still unresolved. Stefanie Damron remained missing. The escalation of the case to the federal level marked a turning point, but not the resolution her family desperately wanted. The investigation now carried the weight of a nationwide search, but the absence of evidence remained the most haunting fact of all. The section closes with the same question that fueled the FBI's involvement. If a 14-year-old girl can walk down a trail near her home in broad daylight and never be seen again, how safe is any community? And who holds the answer to what happened to Stefanie Damron that September afternoon? The investigation into the disappearance of 14-year-old Stefanie Damron had reached a critical point. By late 2024, the FBI had joined state and local police, pouring resources into the case. Dozens of officers, analysts, and specialists sifted through tips, digital records, and witness interviews. Hundreds of leads came in. Each one carried hope. Each one carried the possibility that this missing girl would finally be found. But time and again, that hope ended the same way, with nothing. The first wave of tips seemed promising. People from nearby towns reported seeing a girl who looked like Stefanie. A store clerk in Presque Isle swore she had served a quiet teenager who matched the description. A truck stop worker in Holton said he had seen a girl with brown hair and blue eyes sitting alone outside the gas station. Someone else reported spotting her near a rest area off Interstate 95. Investigators followed up on every single claim. Surveillance cameras were pulled, receipts examined, timelines reconstructed. Each time, it ended in disappointment. The girl in Presque Isle turned out to be a local student who lived a block away. The truck stop sighting was likely a traveler passing through with her family. The rest area report was vague and unconfirmed. None of these leads brought police any closer to Stefanie. Then came the detail that shifted attention: a report about a suspicious vehicle. A neighbor recalled seeing a dark-colored pickup truck parked near the trail where Stefanie was last seen. He told investigators that the truck wasn't familiar in the area. He noticed it sitting there for a while, then disappearing not long after Stefanie walked into the woods. It was a potential breakthrough. Detectives scrambled to find this truck. They checked traffic cameras, highway records, and registration data across Aroostook County. Dozens of pickup trucks matched the broad description. Officers tracked down owners, knocked on doors, and meanwhile, police began looking at people. Investigators created a list of known offenders in the area, individuals with prior convictions for violence, sexual assault, or child-related crimes. Each one was interviewed. Some homes were searched. Their vehicles were tested for DNA and fibers. But every single test came back clean. There was no trace of Stefanie in their possession. No clothing, no personal items, not even a single hair. Still, the investigation pressed forward. As the months passed, sightings of Stefanie were reported farther away. One caller insisted she had seen the teenager at a shopping mall in Bangor, nearly 200 miles from New Sweden. Another swore Stefanie had been at a coffee shop in Portland. Later, a tip came in from across the border in Canada, claiming a girl who resembled Stefanie had been traveling with an unknown man. Each sighting reignited hope. Investigators raced to those towns, pulled video footage, and interviewed employees and customers. And every time, the result was the same. The girl in Bangor was identified as another teenager. The Portland report was dismissed after video showed no resemblance. The Canadian tip unraveled when customs data proved no crossing had taken place. For Stefanie's family, each false sighting was a cruel cycle, brief hope followed by crushing disappointment. Every call that began with the words, "I think I saw her," ended with the same devastating phrase, "It wasn't her." Despite the setbacks, the community of New Sweden did not stop searching. Residents organized weekend sweeps of the woods. Parents and teenagers joined forces, combing through trails, ditches, and riverbanks. Dogs were brought back multiple times, retracing the same areas already cleared. Volunteers marked trees with ribbons, ensuring no spot went unchecked twice. Yet the forest yielded nothing. Not a shoe, not a piece of fabric, not even a footprint that could be linked to Stefanie. Months of effort produced only silence. Investigators admitted what many had begun to feel. This was one of the most baffling disappearances they had ever encountered. Typically, a missing teenager leaves behind something, a digital footprint, a stray belonging, a clue that points to where they went. But in Stefanie's case, there was nothing. No phone activity, no social media, no financial record. Nothing after September 23, 2024. It was as if she had vanished completely from the grid. And then, just when the investigation seemed frozen, there was a flicker of hope. In January 2025, search teams discovered what looked like fabric tangled in the brush near a logging road less than 5 miles from Stefanie's home. It was weathered, worn, and partly buried under leaves. To the naked eye, it appeared to match the color and texture of a blue long-sleeved shirt, the same type of clothing Stefanie had been wearing the day she disappeared. The discovery electrified investigators. The area was sealed off. Forensic specialists carefully collected the fabric, bagging it as potential evidence. Rumors spread quickly through New Sweden. Had Stefanie's shirt finally been found? Was this the first real clue in months? Families and neighbors waited anxiously as the sample was sent to us. The revelation was crushing. Investigators described it as a near breakthrough that collapsed into nothing. For the family, it was another emotional blow. Once again, the chance of finding Stefanie slipped through their fingers. By early 2025, every major lead had unraveled. The suspicious truck remained untraceable. The suspects questioned were cleared. The sightings were false. The fabric in the woods turned out to be meaningless. And the woods, despite endless searches, remained silent. The FBI summarized the situation bluntly. Stefanie had disappeared from all systems the very day she walked into the woods. No digital activity, no official record, no trace in the physical world. Investigators were frustrated. They admitted the case was unlike anything they had dealt with before. Without physical evidence, without reliable witnesses, and without any traceable activity, the disappearance had become a wall of unanswered questions. For the people of New Sweden, the silence was unbearable. They had searched rivers, fields, and farmlands. They had knocked on doors, hung posters, and shared her face on every social media platform. But nothing broke the mystery. The case of Stefanie Damron had reached a painful standstill. Every path taken by investigators ended in the same place, a dead end. By the start of 2025, the unanswered questions loomed larger than ever. Who had driven the mysterious truck? Why had no one come forward? How could there be no trace, not even a small item dropped in the woods? And above all, where was Stefanie? The search for answers was far from over, but for now, the truth remained locked away. In the weeks after Stefanie Damron disappeared, the story began as a local concern in New Sweden, Maine, a small town worried about one of its own. But within days, local media realized this was no ordinary missing person case. A 14-year-old had walked out of her house, taken a short path toward the woods, and never come back. No belongings left behind, no digital trail, no answers. Maine television stations covered the case daily. By October, newspapers across New England were picking up the story. By December, the disappearance of Stefanie Damron was being broadcast on CNN, ABC, and major national talk shows. Commentators debated the case, experts discussed what could have happened, and the public was left asking the same haunting question. How can a child vanish without leaving a trace? Headlines appeared everywhere. Mysterious vanishing of a Maine teen. How can a child disappear without a trace? Articles described the case as the most baffling disappearance Maine had faced in years. Reporters traveled to New Sweden, interviewing neighbors and showing the wooded trails where Stefanie was last seen. National attention pushed the story far beyond a rural county line. As the story grew, the family stepped forward. Stefanie's mother, Crystal, gave her first public interview only a month after the disappearance. On live television, she broke down in tears. She pleaded for anyone with information to come forward. Her voice shook as she said, "We just want her back. Or at least, we want to know what happened." That short statement was replayed across networks. Clips of Crystal crying, clutching a photo of her daughter, ran on the evening news. It was raw and painful to watch. Families across America saw the footage and felt connected to the story. Parents recognized the desperation in her words. For many, it was impossible to turn away. The reaction in New Sweden was immediate. Flyers were printed in bulk. Volunteers posted them on every utility pole, inside grocery stores and at gas stations across Aroostook County. By late 2024, it was nearly impossible to walk through a Maine town without seeing her photo. Blue eyes, brown hair. The description: missing since September 23, 2024. Last seen wearing a blue long-sleeve shirt, jeans, and black Harley Davidson hiking boots. As media coverage grew, nonprofit organizations entered the case. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children added Stefanie's information to its database. They created digital posters that circulated on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. The hashtag #FindStefanie began trending in Maine and appeared in posts nationwide. Strangers shared her story, hoping to spread awareness. Advocacy groups also stepped in. Volunteers raised funds to cover search costs. They bought supplies, printed more flyers, and helped coordinate volunteers. Some groups pushed lawmakers to strengthen procedures for missing children in rural states like Maine. They argued that cases like Stefanie's proved how slowly small towns could react when time was critical. Meanwhile, the FBI expanded its public role. In early 2025, they renewed their reward for credible information: $15,000 to anyone who could help locate Stefanie. Her face appeared on the FBI's official website under the Kidnappings and Missing Persons section. Electronic highway signs across Maine and into New Hampshire displayed the message: missing, Stefanie Damron, age 14. Call FBI with tips. These signs ran day and night. Truck drivers, commuters, and families on road trips saw her name and photo over and over again. The visibility kept her case alive in public memory. But the most powerful image did not come from the FBI or the media. It came from a vigil in early 2025. Crystal stood outside on a cold night, holding her daughter's framed photograph. People across the country, many who had never been to Maine, began to feel a connection. Social media comments poured in from parents, teenagers, and strangers who admitted they couldn't stop thinking about Stefanie. The case no longer belonged to just a small town. It had become a symbol of vulnerability, the reminder that even in quiet rural places, tragedy can strike without warning. The emotional impact was undeniable. Each time news stations replayed Crystal's plea, audiences were reminded of how fragile the line between normal life and sudden loss could be. Viewers at home asked themselves the same question. If this can happen in New Sweden, what does that mean for the safety of children everywhere? Public pressure grew. Residents demanded action from state leaders. The governor of Maine made a statement promising that state resources would remain available until Stefanie was found. Local lawmakers discussed ways to strengthen emergency response protocols for missing children. Some suggested expanding Amber Alert criteria to cover cases like Stefanie's, where abduction was not immediately confirmed but danger was clear. The community of New Sweden did not let the story fade. Fundraisers continued. Posters were updated to remind people that the case was still open. Churches and schools held prayer services. Online campaigns kept her photo circulating. Every small effort was designed to keep Stefanie's name in the spotlight, to prevent the case from slipping into silence. But for the family, the public attention was both a blessing and a burden. Each television interview, each press conference meant reliving the pain. Yet Crystal and her family never stopped speaking. They believed that staying visible was the only way to keep pressure on the investigation. They endured the cameras, the questions, and the headlines, because silence felt like surrender. As spring 2025 approached, the case had reached a turning point. Law enforcement had exhausted early leads, but the public had not lost interest. The continuing media... The chapter closed not with answers, but with determination. Stefanie was still missing. The family was still waiting. The town was still searching. The FBI was still investigating. And across America, people who had never met her still asked the same question every time they saw her photo. Where is Stefanie Damron? By 2025, months had passed since Stefanie Damron vanished from her hometown of New Sweden, Maine. The case had drawn national attention, triggered federal involvement, and mobilized an entire community. But even after massive searches, FBI investigations, and public campaigns, there was still no sign of her. In May 2025, another coordinated search effort was launched. More than 60 volunteers joined law enforcement in combing through the woods, rivers, and abandoned farmland surrounding New Sweden. Drones were flown over miles of forest. Canine units were brought in once again. Specialized teams searched creeks and marshes. The effort stretched for days. Yet, just like before, nothing was found. No clothing, no footprints, no discarded items that could be linked to Stefanie. It was as if the ground had swallowed her whole. This new search underscored what investigators already feared, that Stefanie's disappearance was one of the most confounding missing persons cases in Maine's history. Police admitted publicly that the lack of physical evidence had crippled the investigation. For the family, each failed search meant renewed heartbreak. For the community, it deepened the mystery. Despite the setbacks, officials made it clear the case was still active. The FBI classified Stefanie's disappearance as an open investigation. That status carried weight. It meant agents were still assigned, leads were still being checked, files were not being closed or archived. The case was alive, even if progress was painfully slow. Public pressure remained strong. Flyers with Stefanie's face continued to cover small towns across Maine. They were taped to gas pumps, posted in grocery stores, and pinned on bulletin boards in libraries. Residents in Aroostook County kept her story in view by refusing to let posters fade into the background. In New Sweden, reminders of her absence were everywhere. The law enforcement continued to face questions. Residents asked why more progress hadn't been made. Some criticized the initial response in the hours after Stefanie went missing, arguing that every minute had been crucial. Others wondered if the wooded terrain had been searched thoroughly enough, or if investigators had overlooked potential witnesses. Each press conference brought renewed scrutiny. For the family, every public update was both painful and necessary. Crystal, Stefanie's mother, continued to speak out. She repeated her message. We just want answers. We just want to know what happened. Each plea was raw, delivered not for the cameras, but in the hope that someone, somewhere, would finally come forward. In the absence of answers, speculation grew. Some believed Stefanie had been abducted and taken out of state. Others thought she might have gotten lost in the dense woods and never been found. A smaller number wondered if someone in the community knew more than they were admitting. None of these theories brought comfort, only more frustration. Advocacy groups kept pushing for visibility. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children circulated updated age progression images, showing what Stefanie might look like if she were still alive. These images spread widely on social media, drawing thousands of shares. The campaign was designed to prevent the case from slipping into obscurity, to remind people that Stefanie's story was far from over. The FBI continued to reissue the $15,000 reward for information. Billboards carried her photo. Digital signs on highways displayed her name. In press releases, agents reiterated that any tip, no matter how small, could be crucial. Yet calls slowed, leads dried up. And still Stefanie's whereabouts remained unknown. The emotional toll on New Sweden was immense. A town of fewer than 700 people had been turned upside down. Neighbors locked their doors more often. Parents worried about letting their children walk alone. The disappearance left a shadow for the community. The case became not just about one missing girl, but about accountability. How could a teenager walk away from her house and never return? How could law enforcement, volunteers, and federal agents search thousands of acres and come up empty? How could technology, so often used to track missing teens, provide not a single lead? The frustration grew with each passing month. The aftermath of Stefanie's disappearance revealed deeper questions. About how quickly missing children's cases are escalated. About how resources are deployed in rural towns. About how families are supported when answers don't come. Lawmakers in Maine quietly began reviewing procedures, discussing ways to strengthen the state's child search response. Stefanie's case had become a rallying point for change. Yet for all the talk of reform, for all the efforts to raise awareness, one reality remained. Stefanie Damron was still gone. And without evidence, without a body, and without credible leads, her fate remained an agonizing mystery. As 2025 came to a close, the haunting question persisted. Where is Stefanie? Was she out there somewhere, waiting to be found? Or had something irreversible happened that day in September 2024? For now, no one could say. The closing words of her case were not about resolution, but about persistence. Stefanie's face stayed on posters. Her name stayed on the FBI's website. Her story stayed alive in the hearts of her family and her town. A single truth echoed above all. Until answers are found, until her family knows what happened, justice cannot be complete. Stefanie Damron was only 14 years old when she disappeared, and as of today, the question remains open, unanswered, and deeply painful. Where is she? If you found this story important, don't forget to support